President Trump visits Atlanta on Friday. He's expected to send a message to African American voters who typically vote for Democrats. The message will mostly be about the economy and criminal justice reform, according to an Atlanta-based Trump advisor. 11 Alive's Doug Richards joins us with more on how this message may play out.
Well, Jeff, it will certainly be interesting. The president will be talking to a constituency that overwhelmingly rejected him in 2016 and seems poised to be just as unsupportive heading into next year's election. When he comes to Atlanta Friday, the president is likely to be alongside his Atlanta confidant, Bruce Lavelle. The Dunwoody businessman was in the presidential suite with President Trump during the national championship game at Mercedes-Benz Stadium in January 2018 and has been a confidant since Trump was a candidate. Lavelle predicts President Trump will double his African-American vote next year, mostly because of the economy. Shoot, if he does that, he wins in a landslide, doesn't he?
Well, it's going to be a landslide. The fact that the economy and someone is finally paying attention to what has always been constantly courted, both sides of the aisle, Doug, in all fairness, and no delivery. And now you have someone that's delivering it.
What's your opinion of President Trump?
My opinion is that he's a bigoted, racist person.
So we spent some time at the AU Center talking with African-American voters who have a somewhat different view of the president than Mr. Lavelle. We also have some poll numbers that focus on how President Trump is doing among African-American voters in Georgia. You'll see them on 11 Alive News at 6.
All right.